Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Yes! Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Tonight is November 19th, 2025, and tonight's episode, oh my God, the crown of the dragon, the Li Dynasty, and the rise of the final empire. I know we've talked a lot about the Orsini clan, and we know a lot of the people involved, especially Domenico, Napoleon, Orsini, but we haven't gone into full detail about the Li family. And they are the ones that were given the permission by the Breakspears and Dents to take their breath and then rise from the east. And this is all prophetic. And tonight we're going to be talking about the Li family, how they came to their rise, who they were before, because they were actually part of a huge dynasty. It's lasted for thousands of years. So it's all prophetic. And there is not, let me tell you, there are no books, none, on the Li family. Zip. Nada. Not in China, not in America, not in Europe. They are a ghost, just like the Breakspear family. And this is why I believe that they are absolutely 100% connected and related, because the Li family act like the Breakspear. The Breakspears were in control for 1,000 years while Satan was locked up under the pit. And it is likely and makes sense that it's going to be the Breakspears who kept Satan's throne going on earth while he was in prison for a while until the release. And it makes sense that 250 years ago, that's when Satan was released, and then bam, the Orsinis took over. Because the Breakspears needed to go away and come back and rise through the ashes like a rising phoenix. And we're going to be talking about all that tonight. It's going to be an amazing show, and your minds are going to be blown. And I am excited to be that guy to show it to you. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Boots Hafner, stating, all right, all night long. Hello, Pastor James of the Rumble airwaves and creator of Elite Potion Detoxifier. Hello, warriors and new listeners. Let's hit that thumbs up. Hello, can you hear me now? Thank you. I can hear you just fine, Boots. Hit that thumbs up button, guys. Rumble will only raise me in their algorithm with the likes and not how many subscribers. And, you know, we're getting a lot more subscribers on Rumble lately. And I do believe it's because YouTube has not been blocking my videos lately. So, hey, that's a good thing. Number two warrior is Scorpion, stating, hello, y'all. Glad to be back. That Elite Potion be a rockin'. Dude, the stuff is rad. I mean, I take it. And when I don't feel good, I just take it. And sometimes I forget, you know, because that's just me. I'm just like, if you guys saw my life and how hectic it is, you would realize why I forget to take my pills. But I'm telling you, man, Elite Potion, it is numero uno asameo, and it's the bomb. I don't know how else to say it, because it gives you so much energy, and it gives you peace of mind knowing that you've killed the parasites that cause cancer, period. And on top of that, you know, because you have a metal taste in your mouth when you're taking it, that it's being flushed out of your system. And unfortunately, we have to continue taking this stuff for the rest of our lives, folks. Why? It's because of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And that is what they are pushing onto us and filling us full of metal so we can merge with the machine. And that's what Daniel talked about. The end of days when he saw iron mixing with clay. That is robots and humans. Yeah, that's coming. Number three warrior is Sheila, saying, hey, what's up, Sheila? Sup, buttercups. And number four warrior is Texas Militia Official, saying, howdy, what's up, Tex? And number five warrior is Boofob69, saying, g'day from Melbourne, Australia. Can't wait for a cross return. The only one true king of all kings. Right? Right. How was my accent? I used to do it really well when I was in high school, and I kind of lost it. But I know one thing about Australia is they end everything with a question all the time. It's always up. Every single one? You know? I mean, I can imagine what it's like, breaking up with your girlfriend. It's like, we've been together for a long time, and I think it's time we should see other people. What do you say? Like, man, it would be better to break up with someone in an Australian accent because, hey, you're leaving it as a question. You're not saying you're leaving. Oh, I'm thinking about leaving you. I'm thinking about never seeing you again. Ever? What do you say? What do you say? Okay, enough of that. Next, Warrior is, again, Scorpion, saying, I can't wait for the Epstein bullshit to disappear. Yeah, it's now being used as a party favor politically. And finally, last Warrior is Robert Gertison saying, yo, y'all, I'm up for another amazing show. Thank you. There are times when I do these things, these shows every single night, and I don't feel like I'm doing anything. I just feel like, it's just a blah show, and I have my problems with that. It's not me. It's just the way I am. I just, I get sensitive and I feel like I'm not doing good enough. But when I went through all of my shows, I had to take every single show because I would write them in Mac Notes. And I've got like 800 shows that are on Mac Notes. And as I had to go through all of them and cut and paste and put them into one text file because, long story, I had to. And man, I was looking at all this work and dude, the stuff that's coming out of this office is mind-blowing. And I really do believe it's prophetic. So, yeah. Boofop says, nice one, brav. Nice one, brav. He said probably my accent was pretty good. Well, I'm trying. Isn't that right? Why is it always on an up with the question mark? All right, love you guys. All right, let's get into shitty breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
Such a long intro. Does it have to be so long, James? I know, it's long. Trump signs bill ordering release of Jeffrey Epstein files. Well, which files? The ones that he wants released or the actual real ones? I want to see the files of Trump pissing on hookers. That's what I want to see. Release those files. I want to know the Russian hookers and how they love to give Trump a golden shower. Lawrence Summers to stop teaching at Harvard while it investigates his Epstein ties. Yeah, well, it's Epstein. You guys really think he's dead? He ain't dead, dude. And no, he didn't kill himself either. He's just too valuable of a risk to just kill him. And he's got so much goods on others, but he was so good at blackmailing people. They need that talent. So they're probably going to give him a face job and turn him into somebody else like Face Off. And, instead of it being John Travolta, it's going to be Nicolas Cage. Oh, I'm Nicolas Cage. Anyway, Comey case hanging by a thread as judge squeezes Department of Justice over Halligan's handling. Is Comey going to go to jail? Who cares? Even if he does, justice is not going to be served in the United States because there is no justice. It's a bunch of bullshit. Democratic Congresswoman charged with stealing $5 million in FEMA funds. She did something illegal. And now she's going to have to pay that back. Is she going to go to jail for it? That sounds like fraud to me. Is she going to go to jail? No, nobody goes to jail. Only, it really, if you look at it, Democrats never go to jail, but Republicans do. Isn't that weird? Huh. Well, it depends on who's in charge of the DOJ, because Republicans are too much of pussies to actually jail people live. They won't do it. But Democrats don't give a shit. They'll be like, throw them in jail and videotape the whole thing, right? That's just because they're different. Republicans are more pussy. Democrats have more of a spine. That's just how it is. And believe me, I'm not supporting left or right. They're both working for the same people, the Bank for International Settlements. Do your own research. Trump to meet with Zoran Mamdani in the Oval Office on Friday. Who gives a shit? U.S. and Russian officials draft plan to end Ukraine war based on capitulation. Well, they had to put that in there, huh? Make it sexual. Who gives a shit? Are they going to end the war? No, the war's making money. The war is making money and keeping America profitable because it continues to sell weapons to Ukraine. And Russia's making money off of it too because, well, they're buying or they're I don't know. I don't know how Russia's making any money on it, but they're making money on it. I got to do a show about that. Then I'll have everything all ready to rock. So that's it. There's really nothing else left for breaking news except for the devil's coming to get you. All right, we're going to go to a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about the crown of the dragon, the Li Dynasty, and the rise of the final empire. Stick around.
I'll give you $10,000 if you can find just one person who's never filed a tax return.
I'll give you $10,000 if you can find just one person who's never filed a tax return.
Have you ever filed a tax return? Yes.
Nobody. Not one. It starts at 16. That first job, that first form. The moment they became a taxpayer. Every April 15th, millions keep signing the same contract, thinking it's the law. But it isn't the law that binds them. It's the signature. 98% of Americans never owed it. Learn more at unincorporatedassociations.com.
Put the bunny back in the box. Scorpion. Con Air, probably one of the worst movies ever made. And Nicolas Cage is actually rad in it. I don't know why. Let go of the bunny. Put the bunny back in the box. Anyway. All right, guys. Well, we're going to expose the Li family once and for all. And tonight, what we're going to be talking about is it's going to blow your effing mind. So, because all of this information is hidden. And believe it or not, I was able to stumble across a couple of PDFs that some authors wrote. And I compared it with my notes of the Li family and with Fritz Springmeier's books, the 13 Illuminati bloodlines, which talks about the Li family. And we were able to uncover so many things. I also found a bunch of history books on all of the family dynasties and their rule, and we were able to trace the lineage of the Li family, and it goes back so far, it'll just blow your mind. So let's get into it. Now, for 2,000 years, a single name has traveled through China like a shadow stitched into the fabric of its empires. It survived dynasties, warlords, invasions, revolutions, and the great political purges that pulverized whole families into dust. It hid beneath the rise of Mao, beneath the roar of Tiananmen tanks, beneath the technocratic glow of modern China's surveillance state. And yet, almost no one outside the inner circle knows it. Not because it's unimportant, but because it is the most important detail of all time. And it is the name that built emperors, bankrolled rebellions, and funded the party, controlled the ports, commanded the underworld, and now stands behind the man the world believes rules China. That name is Li, L-I, short for Lancelotti. The dynasty with no face, the family that appears nowhere and everywhere all at once. Now, the world is told that China is governed by ideology through Marxism, Maoism, socialism, with Chinese characteristics, even a little bit of capitalism. But ideologies do not survive 2 millennia. Ideologies do not run triads in Hong Kong and standing committees in Beijing simultaneously. Ideologies do not own global port terminals on both ends of the Panama Canal. Ideologies do not forge alliances with the Jesuits, the opium syndicates, the CIA, the City of London, and BRICS banks. Only a dynasty can do that. Only a bloodline can operate across eras this seamlessly. Only a family with intergenerational discipline, supernatural patience, and a serpent-like ability to shed its skin whenever history actually demands it. Most people have heard the name Li, It is the second most common surname in the world. But that is exactly the disguise. The real Li Dynasty, the Imperial Li, the Tang Li, the Hong Kong Li, the Triad Li, the CCP Li, the Opium Li, that Li cannot be Googled, cannot be traced, cannot be casually researched. There are no documentaries, no exposés, no broken-hearted defectors spilling secrets on Western cable news. Not because the dynasty is benevolent, but because it has mastered the art of structural invisibility. It leaves no paper trail. It allows Li to be so common that the real clan disappears in the crowd. It stands behind power, but never in front of it. And it is the perfect dynasty for a digital age that worships personality while ignoring the systems that create them. Xi Jinping may be the face of China, but the Li are the bones, the blood, and the nervous system. They are the unseen force that elevated him, the structure that protects him, and the dynasty that will outlive him. When Western analysts look at China, they see a monolithic communist party. But when you peel back the layers, you discover something far older and far more dangerous. A hereditary power that predates communism by nearly 2,000 years and has woven itself into every mechanism of the modern Chinese state: political, military, financial, criminal, and spiritual. This is not a story about China alone. It is a story about the beast system forming in real time. A story about a bloodline that controls ports, data, money flows, narcotics, ideology, and surveillance. The very arteries Revelation warned the final empire would command. This is the story of the Li Dynasty, the hidden architects of the dragon's crown, the family behind the world's largest authoritarian regime, an eastern pillar of a global system preparing for its final throne. And tonight, for the first time, we will drag this dynasty out of the shadows. Now, long before there was a China as we know it, before red flags, before the party, before the emperors, there was a man named Li. In the oldest layers of Chinese antiquity, at the dawn of recorded history, the surname Li was not merely a name, it was a mark of distinction, a sign of royal favor, a designation of spiritual authority. And according to the oldest genealogical traditions preserved in the chronicles, the first bearer of the name was Emperor Xuanzhu, who lived more than 4,000 years ago. In the centuries that followed, the Li would rise to unimaginable heights, forming the backbone of the Tang Dynasty, the golden age of China, under Li Yuan and his son Li Shimin, who reshaped Chinese civilization and left an imprint the world still feels today. The Tang era was not just a dynasty. It was a civilizational reset. Oh, we've heard that before in 2030, right? The Li emperors presided over the birth of paper money, the expansion of global trade routes, the perfection of printing, the rise of a cosmopolitan empire that stretched across continents. They engineered systems of governance, commerce, and communication that survived long after their thrones were gone. They multiplied their influence by granting the Li surname to allied clans, vassal families, and powerful bureaucrats, creating a massive interconnected Li network across the provinces. A Li was not just a person, it was an institution. And then something strange happened. The Li disappeared from the imperial forefront, but not from power. They stopped producing emperors, but they never stopped producing rulers. They faded from the throne, but they embedded themselves into the machinery behind it. They did not cling to the crown. They became the advisors, the financiers, the priests, the scribes, the logistics people, the ones who survive when the thrones fall and kingdoms burn. Dynasties fell, Mongols invaded, warlords fought, foreign powers carved China into spheres, revolutions erupted, the Qing dynasty collapsed, and the republic died. Mao rose, and the party crushed the old elite. Yet the Li family endured. They endured because they did not tie themselves to a single ideological thing or regime. They actually tied themselves to the infrastructure that every regime actually depends on. The ports, the roads, the money, the underworld, the intelligence networks, the information channels, the cultural institutions. They became China's perennial substructure, an invisible hand guiding the state through eras of chaos. In a way, they made their money just like the gold rush did. It wasn't the people who dug the gold out who made a fortune. It was all the merchants, the ones who supplied the goods for them to dig the crap out of the ground. Now, when you understand this, everything about modern China becomes clearer. The Li dynasty did not vanish. They've been here all along. I'm not even joking. It merged with the state, surviving revolutions by becoming indispensable to every side that seized power. It survived by mastering adaptation, secrecy, and patience. And when the Communist Party rose, the Li were already there, woven into the bones of China, ready to help rebuild the nation and to embed themselves deeper than ever before. And this is why the Li appear suddenly, inexplicably, at the very apex of the CCP in the 1980s and 90s. This is why they appear in the party's propaganda wing, its financial organs, its military command, and its foreign trade apparatus. This is why they control Hong Kong's underworld and banking system simultaneously. This is why they surface inside every major Chinese transformation, from ancient printing to modern AI. The Li are the dynasty that outlived all dynasties. And now in our age, they've resurfaced, not on thrones of jade, but in the Standing Committee of the CCP, the command centers of global finance, the leadership of triad syndicates, and the infrastructure of BRICS. This ancient bloodline has not merely survived history, it is shaping the future. And if you want to hide a dynasty, well, you've got two options. You can bury it in silence, or you can bury it in plain sight. The Li family chose the latter, the second one. When the Tang emperors elevated allies and loyalists by granting them the Li surname, they accidentally created the perfect camouflage for future generations. Over the centuries, that name multiplied until it became the second most common surname on Earth. More than 1 billion people today carry the name Li, or L-E-E. L-I or L-E-E. And the sheer volume of the name forms a kind of statistical fog, a demographic smokescreen, beneath which the true Li lineage can disappear. But this was not an accident of population, it was a strategy of survival. To understand the genius of this tactic, imagine a single bloodline that needs to operate across dynasties, regimes, revolutions, invasions, and foreign occupations. A family that cannot allow its genealogy to be traced, its estates to be seized, or its members to be singled out during purges. Well, the easiest way to accomplish that is to become indistinguishable, a needle hidden in a billion needles. Now, the Li Dynasty realized what few families of power ever understand. Obscurity is stronger than royalty. And you cannot overthrow what you cannot isolate. You cannot purge what you cannot identify. You cannot destroy what dissolves into the crowd. This is why there are no great Li mansions preserved in Beijing, no towering ancestral temples, no marble effigies of Li monarchs on display. The powerful Li families did not memorialize themselves. They erased their footprints, like the Breakspears did. They avoided the kind of monuments that topple when revolutions come. They shifted from kings to keepers, from emperors to engineers of power. And this is where the brilliance of the surname strategy becomes obvious. A hidden dynasty must hide in the systems, not in the palaces. It must hide in the bureaucracy, the shipping manifests, the intelligence cells, the merchant guilds, the underground networks, the financial ledgers, places no historian thinks to read. You see, the Li understood that the real rulers of China would not be those with crowns, but those with access. Those who controlled the ports, the caravans, the paper trails, the trade routes, the secret societies, the monasteries, the guilds, the criminal networks. These are the arteries of empire. And the Li have spent centuries embedding themselves in every artery. By the time the modern world arrived, the Jesuit missions, European banks, opium ships, and colonial treaties, the Li dynasty was already prepared. They did not resist modernization. They absorbed it. They learned Western finance. They mastered maritime law. They infiltrated both the legitimate and illicit sides of international commerce. And they did it all without ever forming a single structure large enough for an invading power to decapitate, to cut their heads off. So this is why when you scan the historical record, you will find powerful Lis in Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, Shanghai, Beijing, Vancouver, London, and New York, yet no one ever calls them a dynasty. This is why Western intelligence agencies can list the party factions, but never the Li faction. This is why political analysts can map Xi Jinping's rise, but never identify the hand holding the ladder. A dynasty hidden inside a billion surnames cannot be tracked by surface-level analysis. But once you see the pattern, the recurrence of the name at every strategic point of Chinese power, the disguise falls away. You see the Li at the birth of paper money. I found it. You see the Li at the founding of the Tang and military state. You see the Li in the underground triad networks. You see the Li in Hong Kong banking. You see the Li in CCP's standing committee. You see the Li in global shipping conglomerates. You see the Li in narcotics syndicates tied to intelligence operations. You see the Li in BRICS infrastructure and the digital wands architecture. The dynasty is not gone. It's just omnipresent. And the name is not a coincidence. It's a cloak. The power is not new. It's actually ancient. When the Communist Party seized China in 1949, it launched a crusade to annihilate every trace of the old world. Noble families were humiliated in the streets, property was seized, ancestral records were burned, and centuries-old lineages were uprooted with surgical cruelty. Mao believed that aristocracy was the enemy of revolution, and so he waged war against bloodlines themselves. But in this storm of ideological violence, one ancient lineage actually did not break, did not scatter, or even disappear. It just adapted, and it went silent. And it embedded itself deep within the machinery of the new regime. That lineage was the Li. The Li understood something no imperial clan had ever understood before: survival depending on invisibility. While other families clung to titles, land, and public honor, the Li had long mastered the art of dissolving into systems instead of symbols. They didn't care about tombstones or landmarks or public parks and buildings and putting their name on it, because they owned no palaces for mobs to loot. They maintained no grand temples for red guards to actually desecrate. And their power was never built on monuments. It was built on networks: logistical, financial, criminal, maritime, and bureaucratic networks. The very networks that every regime depends on to function. So when the communists purged the aristocracy, the Li simply moved into the technical, infrastructural, and covert spaces the new party desperately needed but did not understand. They were not an enemy to purge. They were a skill set to preserve. And this is why, as Mao killed scholars, generals, bureaucrats, landlords, even financiers, the Li family remained untouched in key positions. They provided maritime access when the party had no ships. They provided underworld channels when the party had no foreign currency. They provided intelligence links when the party had no espionage network. They provided trade, ports, printing, finance, narcotics pipelines, propaganda expertise, and international contacts when the party lacked all of them. So they were more useful alive than dead, more valuable embedded than exposed. And then something remarkable happened. As the party grew in strength, the Li did not merely survive inside it. They rose to its highest throne. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Li dynasty achieved something no other lineage has ever done in communist China. They held 2 concurrent seats on the Politburo Standing Committee, the 7-man inner sanctum that rules all of China. Li Ping, the iron-fisted premier who oversaw Tiananmen, and Ri Ruihan, the propaganda master who shaped the ideological psyche of 1 billion citizens, sat together at the pinnacle of the regime. Their presence there was not symbolic, it was actually structural. And no one even noticed. Other Li figures dotted the upper echelons of the CCP, like Li Jianian, president of China and financial engineer of the post-Mao economy; Li Ka-shing, a Politburo member and military commander with sweeping authority; Li Qiang, whose influence over foreign trade positioned him as a gatekeeper between China and the world. These were not random politicians who happened to share a surname. They represented a concealed inheritance, a pattern of elevation that exposes an invisible backbone inside the communist hierarchy. Political scientists in the West talk about factions within the party, like the Shanghai clique, the Youth League, the Princelings. But these are temporary alliances built on ideology and personal loyalty. The Li faction is older than communism, older than the Republic, older than the Qing Dynasty. It is not ideological. It's structural, intergenerational, and embedded in the skeleton of the Chinese state. It exists in the propaganda bureau. the intelligence organs, the ports, the foreign trade networks, the triads, the shipping cartels, the narcotics pipelines, and Hong Kong's financial architecture. It is everywhere the party needs support, but cannot afford to control directly. By the time Xi Jinping appeared on the national stage, the Li were already holding the hidden levers behind him. Xi did not rise above the Li dynasty. He rose through it. His survival during earlier purges, his rehabilitation, his carefully managed ascent, all intersect with Li protectors, Li intermediaries, and Li engineered networks that smooth his path to power. This is why the party feels immovable. This is why the CCP appears monolithic. A revolution sits on the surface, but an ancient dynasty sits underneath it. And in the next section here, the veil's going to tear open even further, revealing the darkest secret of all, that the Li dynasty did not merely infiltrate the party, they captured the underworld that sustains it, and they're called the triads. Now, to understand how the Li dynasty became the most powerful unseen force in China, you must step into a realm the Communist Party has always feared, yet has never been able to fully suppress: the triads or triads. These syndicates, Hong Kong's brotherhoods, Shanghai's ancient guilds, Guangdong's secret societies, did not vanish when the communists took power. They adapted, just as the Li did. They survived occupation, purges, colonial rule, and communist crackdowns. They became the parallel nervous system of the Chinese-speaking world, running ports, smuggling routes, private banks, trafficking corridors, and intelligence channels beyond the reach of any regime. They're just like a mob and a secret society. And in my internal documents that I've revealed, the truth is laid bare. The Li dynasty did not simply influence the triads, they led them. They ran their chapters, commanded their networks, and oversaw their international expansion. Names appear all across Hong Kong, Shanghai, Hunan, Guangzhou, and even Britain. Li Qitang, Li Hyungshengqi, Li Hyungshengchang, Li Hong, Li Kai-chen, Li Pingqing, Li Lapting, Li Chou-fat, Li Jafar Ma. Each one are associated with the triad hierarchy, and each one connected to a Li lineage that spans both the criminal and political worlds. This was not an accident. It was strategic inheritance. Now, while the Communist Party sought to crush disorder, it still desperately needed access to the tools only the underworld possessed. Foreign currency, for example, maritime smuggling lanes, off-book manpower, discreet violence, global trafficking routes, and the ability to move goods and information without official scrutiny. That's a CIA to me. No ideology can replace these functions. No bureaucracy can replicate them. And the CCP hated the triads, but depended on the architecture the triads built. And the Li dynasty stood at the gateway to that architecture. Hong Kong became the fulcrum of this hidden empire. To Western eyes, Hong Kong was a British trading post turned global financial hub. To insiders, it was something even deeper. A city where colonial law, Chinese commerce, organized crime, intelligence services, and banking dynasties merged into a single organism. And at the center of that organism was the Li family. They ruled Hong Kong's legitimate economy through billionaires like Li Ka-shing, and they ruled its illegitimate economy through triad patriarchs whose bloodlines traced back to the same ancient source. This dual rule, legal and criminal, visible and invisible, allowed the Li to dominate Hong Kong more completely than any governor, banker, or party official ever could. But Hong Kong was the only one of the Li dynasty's underworld pillars. In the southeast, the Golden Triangle became the largest opium production zone on Earth, supplying heroin pipelines that stretched into North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. At the center of this network was General Li Mi, a man who collaborated directly with the CIA, who ran vast poppy fields and laid the groundwork for cross-continental narcotics operations that would fund covert wars, secret armies, and black market financing for decades. After Li Mi came, Li Wenhuan came after him. Then Li Jianian, the man that my research calls the money god. He's a Li elder credited with selling enough opium to pay China's debts and stabilize its collapsing currency during the regime's most volatile years. This fusion of underworld intelligence and political figures paints a picture that very few historians have dared confront. The Li dynasty was never merely a criminal family or a political clan. It was both. It used narcotics to finance political survival. It used triad violence to enforce economic dominance. It used Hong Kong financial platforms to launder the proceeds of both. And it used global shipping and port control to move everything, from drugs to data, across borders under the world's radar. This is why China controls ports in California, so they can ship drugs. This is why the Li could not be purged. They were not a side branch of Chinese power, no. They were the hidden infrastructure beneath it. And they controlled the arteries that the CCP itself depended on. The ports where foreign currency moved. The smuggling routes where strategic goods flowed. And the pipelines where narcotics funded covert programs. The triad syndicates that handled the dark operations that no government ever admit exists. This is the empire beneath the empire. The party sits above the surface. The Li dynasty sits below it. And the system below always outlives the system above. Next, we're going to follow the Li dynasty out of China entirely, revealing how they grafted themselves into Western banking dynasties, global shipping conglomerates, and the architecture of worldwide finance, becoming not merely China's head rulers, but a global force shaping the very machinery of the beast. Now, to understand how the Li dynasty became more than a Chinese power, you must follow their movement beyond China's borders, into the colonial ports, British banking houses, American intelligence hubs, and global shipping empires that define the modern world. This is where the dynasty transcends regional influence and becomes a transnational force. Most families of power remain confined to their homeland and their identity anchored in geography. The Li, however, are not tied to any place. They're tied to systems, finance, ports, narcotics, intelligence, and infrastructure. And systems are borderless. This is why the Li were uniquely positioned to partner with Western elites when the world entered the age of globalized trade, which we're in right now. When Britain seized Hong Kong in the 1800s and turned it into the empire's financial gateway to Asia, the Li did not resist the new order. They integrated into it. The British needed intermediaries who understood Chinese commerce, Chinese culture, Chinese criminal syndicates, and Chinese maritime networks. The Li had already mastered all of them. And so the dynasty adapted their ancient survival strategy to a new empire. They became the bridge between China and the West, trusted by both, but controlled by neither. The strategy crystallized in the rise of Li Ka-shing, the most influential businessman in modern Chinese history. Western media tells his story as a bootstrap success, the tale of a refuge turned billionaire. But my documents make it very clear that Li Ka-shing was not an anomaly. He was the modern face of an ancient dynasty entrusted with the financial instruments that would make the Li indispensable to global trade. Seriously. I lost my spot. So I was kind of like, So he was the modern face of ancient dynasty, all right? He was entrusted with the financial instruments that made the Li indispensable. And his conglomerate, C.K. Hutchison, grew into the largest port operator on Earth, controlling terminals in Europe, Asia, Middle East, Australia, and both ends of the Panama Canal. No single corporation has ever commanded such a strategic maritime footprint, and yet Western regulators never recognized it as geopolitical. They saw C.K. Hutchison as a private company, not as the global arm of a dynasty that had mastered port governance since the Tang Dynasty standardized imperial shipping. While the world saw Li Ka-shing as an investor, the insiders saw the truth. He was a sovereign without a state, a maritime king controlling the arteries of global commerce. Or you could just say a pirate. A fleet that moves without flags. A merchant network with more influence than money, or more influence than many governments. He was a quiet partner to Western capital, British intelligence, and multinational banking houses that needed access to Asia's markets. The Li dynasty, through his empire, placed itself inside the circulatory system of global trade, so deeply that the world could not disentangle China from Li ports, even if they tried. But the Li dynasty's infiltration of the West did not stop at shipping. My research reveals that the Li established the Li Commercial Bank on Long Island, granting them a foothold in the American financial system in a blue state. Then came Victor Li, positioned at the East-West Center in Hawaii, a blue state, a U.S.-Asia academic and intelligence crossroad where diplomats, spies, researchers, and policymakers quietly shape Pacific strategy. These placements were not random. They were strategic nodes linking the Li dynasty into the operating system of American power. And then there is the opium connection, the element Western historians consistently underplay. The British Empire built much of its wealth on narcotics, but they relied heavily on Chinese intermediaries to distribute, transport, and process the trade. The Li dynasty's deep entanglement with opium syndicates, triads in Hong Kong, shipping networks in the Pearl River Delta, and warlord-led fields in the Golden Triangle made them indispensable partners to both British merchants and Western intelligence agencies. What began as colonial narcotics routes evolved into Cold War covert pipelines, money laundering channels, black market currency routes, and clandestine supply chains that allowed Western powers to influence Asia without leaving fingerprints. The Li were the hinge. The intermediaries would and could operate above and below the law simultaneously. So as the world globalized, the Li did not simply rise with it, they actually shaped it. They built the shipping grid on which global trade depends. They established financial institutions that moved seamlessly between East and West. And they leveraged triad networks to facilitate transactions governments could not officially sanction. They embedded themselves in colonial finance, American academia, British port governance, and multinational corporate structures. And they became the Eastern counterpart to Western dynasties like the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Sassoons, the Warburgs, and the Breakspear line. But unlike those families, the Li operate from behind a demographic fog. Their name is just too common to trace, or too widespread to isolate, too embedded to uproot. Western elites embraced the Li because they needed them. British colonizers needed their maritime networks. American intelligence needed their covert channels. Global finance needed their ports. Corporate empires needed their logistical mastery. And through every partnership, the Li never lost themselves. They just absorbed. They learned. They adapted. They expanded. And they positioned themselves so deeply into the skeleton of the global system that removing them would collapse entire sectors of the world economy. And by the time of the 21st century arrived, the Li dynasty had accomplished something unprecedented. They were simultaneously a pillar of the CCP, a backbone of Hong Kong finance, a sovereign force in triad underworlds, a global port empire, and a silent partner in Western power structures. They were not a Chinese dynasty anymore. They were a global one. And in the next section, we will uncover how they used this global foundation to shape the rise of Xi Jinping, positioning him not as a supreme ruler of China, but as the public face of a throne much older, deeper, and more distributed than the modern world has ever recognized. Now, to understand Xi Jinping's rise, you must first remove the myth that he is the singular architect of modern China. The Western world imagines Xi as an emperor, self-made, iron-willed, and absolute. But emperors do not appear from nowhere. They do not rise without patrons. They do not survive the purges of rival factions without protection. They do not inherit a geopolitical throne without the blessing of the silent partners that built it long before they arrived. In the case of Xi Jinping, that silent power was the same force that had shaped China for generations, the Li dynasty. Now, Xi was not born into the party's inner sanctum through his own merit. He was born into it through preservation. His father, Xi Jinping, survived political death during the Maoist purges because of interventions from networks that had the ability to shield him. Those networks were not ideological. They were not revolutionary. They were not even moral. But they were structural and deeply connected to the Li. My internal documents point repeatedly to the Li Weihan, a Li elder who wielded tremendous influence within the United Front, stepping in at critical moments to protect Xi Jinping's lineage. This intervention ensured that Xi bloodline would not be erased like so many others. It ensured that Xi Jinping would grow up inside the party's ecosystem instead of outside of it. It ensured that he would be positioned for rehabilitation, not destruction. And decades later, another Li emerged at the precise moment of Xi's political resurrection. Li Rui, R-U-I, as a party historian, archivist, and insider with an almost priestly authority over the CCP's narrative memory. Li Rui played a pivotal role in rewriting Xi's political obituary into a resume. Without that intervention, Xi's ascent would have been impossible. Being remembered correctly is one of the most important forms of political capital in a one-party state. Li Rui gave Xi that capital. And this is why Xi's rise looks so effortless from the outside. It was orchestrated from the inside by a lineage with a vested interest in placing a loyal, controllable, and symbolically useful figure at the helm. Xi did not conquer the party. He stabilized it during a transition engineered by the Li, who needed a leader strong enough to consolidate power but weak enough to depend on the dynasty that elevated him. Xi became the perfect instrument, a man with deep party roots but no independent aristocracy behind him. A man born into the system but born into a competing bloodline. Not born into a competing bloodline. So a man whose authority appeared total but whose foundation rested on unseen hands. And this is why the Li continued to dominate the CCP even as Xi consolidated his power. The Standing Committee had been full of Lis during the decades that shaped modern China. Li Ping in the premiership, Li Rihuan over propaganda, Li Jianyan rewriting the financial architecture of the state. And when Xi took the helm, these foundational elements remained Li engineered, Li influenced, Li protected. Xi simply became the face of the machine the Li had spent decades building. Now, the myth of Xi's absolute control collapses the moment you examine the structure beneath him. The security organs he supposedly commands rely on triad-linked networks for operations the government cannot admit. The economic system he oversees depends on the global port empire built by Li Ka-shing. The propaganda narratives that legitimize him were shaped by Li Ruihan's ideological reforms. The financial stability he claims credit for is built on frameworks established by Li Jianyan. Even his foreign trade strategy echoes the pathways first mapped out by Li Qiang. Every major pillar of Xi's authority rests on Li foundations, Li networks, Li logistics, Li underworld pipelines, and Li global partnerships. So that is the paradox of Xi Jinping. He appears to be the most centralized leader in China since Mao, yet the very system he commands was structured by a dynasty far older and deeper than the Communist Party. Xi did not create the modern Chinese state. He simply inherited a throne crafted by the Li, reinforced by their networks, expanded by their global reach, and secured by their underworld alliances. He simply sits atop a mountain whose shape he did not design. And this is why the world misreads China. Analysts assume the CCP is China's central nervous system. But beneath the party lies a scaffold of bloodlines, brotherhoods, syndicates, banking dynasties, and maritime empires that predate the party and will outlive it. The Li dynasty is the oldest and most entrenched of those forces, as it uses the party as a shell. It uses Xi as a mask. It uses the modern Chinese state as a vehicle. And what moves beneath that vehicle is not Marxism, not socialism, not nationalism, but the same multi-thousand-year dynasty that learned to rule from the shadows long before the West existed. In Part 7, we're going to expose the final layer of this hidden architecture, how the Li dynasty merged with globalist systems, Western banking, Jesuit infiltration, Bank for International Settlement structures, BRICS expansion, and Vatican-linked lineages to form the Eastern pillar of the beast system rising in our time. Now, to see the Li dynasty clearly, you must stop viewing China as an isolated power and begin seeing it as one half of a global architecture, a structure rising in two halves, East and West, each built by lineages that long ago transcended nation states. The Western pillar is familiar, the Breakspier's papal line, the Venetian banking dynasties, the Rothschild and Rockefeller nodes, the City of London, the Jesuit intelligence networks, and the global institutions they seeded, like the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, the United Nations, NATO, and more. But what remains unseen is the Eastern pillar, a parallel hierarchy equally ancient, equally cunning, and equally committed to the final system Revelation describes. That pillar is the Li dynasty. Remember last night we talked about the new computer chips that China's going to roll out that are going to put all micro semiconductor businesses out of business. The Li family are going to do this. That's why they're not worried about their economy. And they're not even worried about Trump and his war machine surrounding Venezuela, which China controls. Now, this connection did not begin with communism. It began centuries earlier when the Jesuits entered China and embedded themselves in the imperial court, studying its rituals, translating its texts, mapping its geography, and quietly forming alliances with families who could bridge the two worlds. The Breakspere lineage, through Jesuit successors and religion, brought Western commercial law, maritime strategy, and economic philosophy into China long before the British ever planted a flag in Hong Kong. The opium traders, especially the Dent family, continued this integration, turning China's coastal infrastructure into a testing ground for global narcotics finance. Through these fractures in the empire, the Li Dynasty emerged as the trusted intermediary between East and West. And as the British sought profit and dominance, the Li provided the networks needed to make it possible. When Western banks needed access to Asia, the Li offered shipping, smuggling, underworld routes, and commercial bridges. When the Vatican needed influence inside the Middle Kingdom, the Li helped deliver cultural access the missionaries alone could never secure. When Western intelligence needed deniable channels in the Cold War, the Li, already controlling the triads and the Golden Triangle, supplied the pipelines. These alliances were not ideological, they were structural. They were about infrastructure, leverage, and control. And what emerged was a hidden equilibrium. Western elites controlled the financial architecture of the world through institutions like the Bank for International Settlements. And Eastern elites, especially the Li family, controlled the logistical arteries of the world through ports, shipping, and shadow commerce. One controlled the money, the other controlled the movement. And together they formed a system far more powerful than any government. They built a world where trade, drugs, data, money, and human bodies flowed through channels no elected leader could regulate. Yeah, they're into human trafficking. This partnership explains why the Li dynasty expanded globally in ways no other Chinese lineage ever did. They were not merely responding to opportunity. They were fulfilling a centuries-long role as the Eastern counterpart to Western dynastic power. This is Joachim and Jacob, or Jacob and Boaz, the two pillars that hold up the whole Freemasonic structure, East-West. This is why Li Ka-shing's shipping empire was welcomed in Panama, Rotterdam, and the Caribbean. This is why Li bankers were quietly integrated into British financial circles. This is why Li intermediaries became essential to American Pacific policy. And the dynasty was not an outsider entering Western systems, it was a partner, a counterpart, a mirror. A mirror. And this is where BRICS enters the story. Analysts assume BRICS is a geopolitical rebellion against Western alliance, Western influence, the Federal Reserve. But when you look at a network of ports, infrastructure grids, telecom lines, and digital currency corridors behind BRICS, the Li dynasty appears everywhere. They control the shipping gateways that BRICS nations rely on. They control the telecom networks that connect BRICS economies. They control the physical entrances and exits of global trade. The very circulatory systems, the beast system, will eventually weaponize for control through economics. Total control. The Western pillar has financial authority. The Eastern pillar has logistical authority. And the beast system needs both. And the Li dynasty stands at the center of the eastern half. This is why the rise of digital currency is not simply a Chinese project. It's a global one. The digital yuan, the emerging BRICS currency, the cross-border settlement systems, all sit atop port, telecom, and infrastructure networks shaped by Li enterprises. The Vatican has spiritual authority, the Bank for International Settlements has monetary authority, and the Li have logistical authority. And when these authorities fuse, you no longer have nations, you have a throne. And in this structure, Xi Jinping is not the emperor. He is just the mask, just like Trump. The system underneath him is the body. And the Li dynasty is the spine. Next, we're going to examine why the Li dynasty's logistical dominance, ports, cables, infrastructure, grids, all that, is not merely political or economic power, but the very architecture that the final empire will require to control who buys, who sells, who moves, and who is silenced. Now, when Revelation describes a system where no one can buy or sell without the mark, it does not describe a political ideology. It describes an infrastructure, a global grid of control over movement, money, identity, and access. For centuries, theologians tried to imagine how such a system could function. They thought it would require a world emperor or a single unified government or a supernatural entity commanding global obedience. But the beast system, as it forms today, reveals something different. It is not a regime, it is an architecture. It is built not from elections or armies, but from the hidden infrastructure that determines who moves, who trades, who communicates, and who participates in the world economy. And the Li dynasty has spent generations embedding itself into every one of these gateways. And consider the ports. Remember, I told you guys that Trump sending in the National Guard to these blue states has nothing to do with immigration. It has to do with the ports. Because the blue states are running on Chinese logistics owned by the Li family. And that just so happens to be a competitor of the Orsinis. Modern trade does not move through ideology or diplomacy. It moves through maritime choke points. And the Democrats are definitely making choke points for the red states, which are controlled by the Orsini clan in Europe. Whoever controls the ports controls the world arteries. C.K. Hutchison, Li Ka-shing's empire, became the world's largest port operator, managing terminals across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. They control both ends of the Panama Canal, people. This is why BlackRock wanted to buy them. They operated critical gateways in Rotterdam, Felixstowe, Brisbane, Karachi, Terminal Island, and throughout Southeast Asia. These ports handle everything from oil to food to semiconductors. And when a dynasty controls ports, it controls not nations, but the lifeblood nations require. Then there are the cables. Most people think the internet is wireless. It's not. 99% of global data travels through undersea fiber optic cables, physical lines running along the ocean floor. And a significant portion of Asia's cable landing stations, telecom infrastructure, and backbone facilities fall under Li enterprises or Li partner networks. This means the dynasty does not merely control physical goods, it controls information flow itself. And whoever governs ports controls bodies. The Li dynasty has positioned itself quietly in both realms. And next are the power grids and utility infrastructures. CK Infrastructure, another Li arm, has acquired or partnered with electricity distribution systems, water utilities, and energy grids across multiple continents, including the United States of America. These systems are not headline grabbing, but they are existential. When a government wants to cripple a population, it shuts off the grid. When a regime wants to force compliance, it manipulates energy access. When a system wants to regulate human behavior, it controls the utilities that sustain life. The Li Dynasty, through these acquisitions, has embedded itself into the vital soft tissue of the modern world. The infrastructure that determines whether societies remain functional or collapse. And this brings us to the final piece, which is digital currency. The world believes China's digital yuan is a Chinese invention created for party control. But when you examine the logistical foundation beneath it, the ports, the telecoms, the shipping lanes, the energy grids, you discover a different truth. The digital yuan and the coming BRICS settlement systems require a physical backbone that only the Li have spent decades assembling. Western central bankers focus on monetary policy. The Li focus on logistics. The beast system requires both. The Western pillar to handle global finance and the Eastern pillar to handle global movement. And together they form a net from which no one escapes. And this is why the Li Dynasty is critical to the final empire. Economic control is not ideological, it is infrastructural. And when governments fall, infrastructure remains. When political systems collapse, ports and cables and grids do not vanish. They are inherited. They're passed down. They become the skeleton of whatever rises next. And the Li Dynasty did not build their empire to serve communism. They built it to survive communism and to survive whatever comes after. They built a throne beneath the governments of the world so that when the beast system emerges, its architecture is already in place. Now, people look at the CCP and see authoritarianism. People look at BRICS and see rebellion. People look at the Western central banks and see financial tyranny. But the true power sits beneath them all. The infrastructure that links their systems together. And in that subterranean architecture, the Li Dynasty is not a participant. It's a cornerstone. So they have a table at the Bank for International Settlements. And in the next section, we're going to bring the pieces together. The ancient bloodlines, the underworld empire, the Western partnerships, the digital infrastructure, and the rise of Xi to reveal the structure of the beast system as it stands now, and the role the Li Dynasty plays as its Eastern crown. Now, of course, every empire has its throne, but not every throne is visible, as we're learning. Some thrones are carved in marble, guarded by soldiers, sanctified by tradition. Others are carved in secrecy, guarded by syndicates, sanctified by bloodlines. The Li Dynasty never sought the first kind. They built the second. And as the world accelerates toward the system Revelation warned about, the Li have positioned themselves at the point where infrastructure, ideology, and global governance converge. They are not the rulers of China alone. They are the keepers of the dragon's Eastern crown. And to understand this crown, you must recognize that modern power is no longer housed in palaces or capitals. Power flows through cables, ports, grids, currencies, data centers, and the institutions that manage them. The beast system is not born from elections or armies. It rises from the infrastructure that defines who can participate in the economy and who can be cut out with the flip of a switch. The Li Dynasty controls far more of this infrastructure than most governments do. They control the physical entrances and exits of global trade. They control the telecom veins that pulse with the world's information. They control the covert networks governments rely on but never admit exist. They control the narcotics pipelines that have financed black operations for decades and hundreds of years. They control the utility grids that provide life and the financial channels that process its costs. They are the silent engineers of dependency. And this is why the Li Dynasty's influence over Xi Jinping is not simply political. It is existential, as Xi stands atop a state that cannot function without Li networks. The party relies on triad syndicates for deniable violence, on Li ports for foreign currency flows, on Li-linked infrastructure companies for energy distribution, and on Li global partnerships for economic leverage. Xi is the public symbol of China's power, but the dynasty that supports him is the one that ensures the lights stay on, the trade routes stay open, the foreign currencies keep flowing, the underworld remains controlled, and the digital yuan has a physical backbone capable of global expansion. Xi is the face, the Lis are the architecture. And this structure aligns perfectly with Revelation's blueprint. You know, if you're a Christian, the scripture describes a beast with many heads, political heads, economic heads, spiritual heads, all forming one unified system of control. The Western head sits in the BIS, IMF, Vatican, and global banking dynasties. The Middle Eastern head sits in the petro networks and religious strongholds preparing their own alignment. The Eastern head, the one that gives power to the dragon, sits in infrastructure, ports, cables, data, digital currency, and underworld logistics. And that head is the Li dynasty. Not because they claim divinity or overt political authority, but because they control the mechanisms the beast system requires to enforce obedience. This is the crown the world never sees, a bloodline that rules by controlling the structures beneath governments. Governments rise and fall, folks. Regimes collapse. Parties fracture. But infrastructure remains. And the Li dynasty has embedded itself into the infrastructure of both East and West so deeply that when the final global system forms, their networks will be indispensable to its function. The dragon in Revelation is not merely a symbol of pagan empire. It is a symbol of global machine that speaks, moves, breathes, and enforces through systems of control. And the Li dynasty, through centuries of adaptation, deception, integration, and survival, has become the nervous system of that machine. And this is probably the most detailed information you can ever get or find about these people. Because the world believes China is the rising superpower. Even the United Nations gave them the okay. But in truth, China is the vessel. The CCP is the shell. Xi Jinping is the mask. The Li dynasty is the crown. And the crown has already attached itself to the emerging global order, waiting for the moment when the beast system requires the infrastructure only they can provide. In the next section, we're going to conclude the scroll by revealing how this dynasty, the Lis, together with the Western pillars, forms the complete architecture of the beast, financial, logistical, political, spiritual, and why their convergence marks the final stage before the enforcement system of Revelation becomes fully operational. Now, every force described in this scroll, every dynasty, every institution, every network, every shadow structure has been moving towards a single point of convergence. Scripture calls this point the beast. History calls it globalization. Technologists call it integration. Bankers call it unification. But in reality, it is the merging of the old world's hidden powers with the new world's technological infrastructure. And at that convergence stands a partnership that has remained invisible to the public for centuries. The marriage of the Western financial throne and the Eastern logistical throne. Now, the Western pillar controls the issuance of money, the architecture of debt, the central banking system, the trade agreements, the intelligence alliances, and the spiritual apparatus that legitimizes them. The Eastern Pillar, anchored by the Li Dynasty, controls the ports, the power grids, the telecom veins, the triad networks, the narcotics pipelines, the shipping empires, and the digital interfaces that will become the enforcement mechanism of global commerce. When these two pillars join, the beast system gains both of its lungs. And the West controls the breath, and the East controls the body. And together they animate a world order where participation is voluntary only until the moment it is not. This is why the rise of BRICS is not a rebellion against the West, but a restructuring engineered by the same elite families who have been shaping global power flows for generations. Western institutions are not being displaced. They're being mirrored, duplicated, and fused into a parallel architecture that can be activated when the old one collapses. This is why the same global banks that shaped the post-World War II order are quietly intertwined with BRICS infrastructure projects. This is why the City of London retains its influence over Asian shipping routes. This is why the Vatican builds diplomatic bridges with Beijing while condemning it publicly. This is why intelligence agencies continue, even as politicians or intelligence, they continue their sharing agreements between Western and Asian agencies, and they continue even as politicians pretend the world is actually divided. Well, the world's not divided. It's synchronizing. You're divided because they've divided you through race, politics, sex. And the Li Dynasty sits at the heart of all that synchronization. Their control over ports provides the physical gateways the beast system will require. And their influence over triad networks ensures access to the dark economy governments use for covert operations. This is human trafficking shit here. Their global telecom infrastructure provides the digital pathways through which surveillance and digital identity systems will flow. And their presence in banking, trade, and global shipping gives them leverage over nations that depend on these channels for survival. So they're not acting on behalf of China. They are acting on behalf of a transnational power structure that predates modern China entirely and will outlive it. This is why Xi Jinping's China is not breaking away from the West. It's simply merging with it at the infrastructural level. The political theater of rivalry distracts the hidden architecture of cooperation. Western elites need Eastern logistics. Eastern elites need Western financial standardization. And both sides need global digital identity systems, programmable currency, and infrastructure control to enforce a unified economic system. This is the true meaning of Revelation's warning that the beast would cause both rich and poor, small and great, to receive a mark without which none may buy nor sell. It's not describing ideology, it's describing an infrastructure. And the Li Dynasty understands this better than any family on earth. They have prepared for centuries for a moment when global power would no longer depend on kings or presidents, but on the controls of the systems beneath them. They have embedded themselves not in politics, which is too volatile, but in infrastructure, which is eternal. Dynasties fall, ports remain, governments collapse, cables and grids stay online, empires rise and fall, shipping lanes stay open. This is why the Li Dynasty did not chase thrones. They chased the gateways that outlive thrones. And they prepared a world where the real rulers are those who control the arteries of the global machine. And now that machine is almost complete. The Western bloodlines control the breadth of the system and the issuance of currency, the management of global finance, the spiritual legitimacy of the old order, and the Li Dynasty controls the body. The infrastructure that regulates movement, access, and compliance. When these two merge, the final empire will have everything it needs: the authority to decree and the power to enforce. That's a voice and a fist, a crown and a sword, a law and a mechanism, a beast and the dragon that gives it power. So to conclude, the story of the Li Dynasty is not the story of a family. It is the story of a structure. One that predates nations, survives revolutions, transcends ideologies, and outlives empires. Every piece of evidence gathered across this scroll reveals the same truth over and over. The Li do not rule through titles, crowns, elections, or force. They rule through the infrastructure beneath civilization. And in a world racing towards digital identities, programmable currency, global supply chains, unified telecom grids, and AI-managed commerce, infrastructure is the final throne. This is why the Li Dynasty really matters today. And this is why their fingerprints stretch all across ports, triads, narcotics pipelines, global shipping, digital currency, and the CCP itself. Because they're not merely participants in history. They are the architects shaping the hidden scaffolding of a present age. And Revelation describes a beast that rises not through charisma or conquest, but through a system that controls who buys and who sells. And for centuries, theologians could not imagine how such a system could work. But today, it seems pretty damn obvious. You do not need a world emperor to enforce economic obedience. You need infrastructure that can deny movement, block transactions, silence communication, and regulate energy. You need ports, grids, cables, satellites, data centers, and digital currency. You need networks that operate below the surface, invisible to the public, but essential to every modern economy. The Li Dynasty has embedded itself precisely in all of those places, and they are not building a Chinese empire. They are preparing the logistical half of the final global system. And this is why their rise coincides with the collapse of trust in Western institutions. The Vatican's power fractures as its true alliances came to light. The BIS restructures global finance as debt cycles become unsustainable. And BRICS forms a parallel system precisely as Western dominance erodes. AI emerges as a counterfeit breath, knowledge without soul, memory without spirit. Nations shake, economies shudder, old orders fall, and beneath the rubble, the infrastructure web remains. Ports, grids, cables, digital currencies awaiting the next authority power enough to command them. The Li Dynasty has positioned itself to ensure that whoever inherits the system will depend on them. And yet within this dark architecture, there is a deeper revelation. The beast system is not rising because God lost control. It's rising because prophecy is unfolding. Human elites believe they are building a tower of power, a technological Babel that will let them control the world. But Scripture reveals the truth. They're building the very structure that God will judge. The convergence of Western finance and Eastern logistics is not a triumph of elite engineering. It's the preparation for a verdict. And their system rises so that it can be struck. Their empire tightens so that it can be shattered. And their throne solidifies so that the true king can overturn it publicly. The Li Dynasty believes it has mastered invisibility. It believes it has survived every purge, every invasion, every regime for a reason. And it believes it will hold power through the transition from old order into the new. But prophecy reveals otherwise, folks. The beast system does not endure, it burns. And the dragon empowers it for a short season, not forever. The very infrastructure the Li have spent centuries constructing will become the evidence used against the nations. The ports, cables, digital currencies, and global grids that they crafted will expose the fragility of human control and the folly of global rebellion. And this is why my work matters. Because exposing the hidden architecture is not about political theory. It's about preparing the remnant. It's about showing the people of God that the beast system is not a future fantasy. It is a present infrastructure. And it's about revealing that the throne rising in the east is not sovereign. It's temporary. It's temporary. It's about reminding the world that no dynasty, no network, no beast, and no dragon can outwit the one who wrote the story. The Li Dynasty has built the Eastern Pillar. Yay. of the final empire. Yay! But the eastern pillar will fall with the western one. And when it falls, the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.